All right. Well, I was trying to decide about what to talk about and whether to tell funny stories about Ken or about my own travails. And I thought, I'll take this chance really to try to place uh, the whole Vision Lab into historical context and how really what happened in the past 25 years is something remarkable of historical importance. It's essentially the second blossoming of Gestalt psychology, and it is the people in this room who will take that second flourishing of Gestalt psychology into Gestalt neuroscience. So I thought I'd present something of a historical perspective that isn't focused specifically on Ken, but it's really about us and this movement that you are all a part of. So, okay. Right, so you're all familiar with this. So Wertheimer is sitting on a train. Oh my God, here, I'll just use these arrows. There we go, all right. So you've all seen this kind of display. So it's 1910, 1912, something like that, and Max Wertheimer sitting on a train. I think he's going to Frankfurt. And he's not looking at this one, he's looking at a different sort of apparent motion stimulus, but he has a kind of awakening and he realizes, wow, there's no motion in this thing, and yet I perceive motion. Therefore, the motion must be a construction of my brain. And the rest is, in a way, history, but this is the beginning of it. And I thought, okay, let's go back and let's look at some of the even deeper history of the Gestalt psychology movement, where it came from, and maybe we can reach to a point to understand where it's going. I'd say the deepest roots lie with the pre-Socratics, especially Heraclitus, who argued, a person never steps in the same river twice, that all is change, all is flux, all is impermanence. And the person who would have the opposite view would be Parmenides. I think Ken would reject Parmenides, I think, and favor Heraclitus. Is that right? Is it? Or maybe, I shouldn't ask. Okay, Protagoras, okay. Anyway, but the deepest roots of the notion that all is flux, all is, in a way, appearances, and to focus on the appearances and take seriously things as they seem, I think starts with Heraclitus, around whatever that is, 500 BC. But, the next person to really pick up on this thread is Plato with his allegory of the cave, where, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, so I won't dwell on it, there's this reality, the deep reality, the thing in itself may be out there, but what we have available to us is the image, in this case a bunch of shadows, and we have to infer based upon this image what's going on out there in reality. And this is a very important thread. So Plato begins to zoom in on the world of appearances and the inferential processes that go into the construction of reality, based upon very sparse data, namely the shadows, and in our world, the image. This is lost for centuries, millennia even, but Descartes now picks up on the question, what can I know for sure? And he says, well, the only thing I can know for sure is my own conscious experience. And he begins paying very close attention to that. That's then picked up by Kant, who really lays bare this very important notion that there may be a world out there of things in themselves, but we really can't talk about them because we have no direct access to them. The only thing we have direct access to is the phenomena itself. So let's pay attention to that and try to understand that. So these are the deep roots of the Gestalt psychology movement. I'd say as we're entering the scientific age, Helmholtz really is the first to have this deep insight that there are all these unconscious inferences that go into the construction of our phenomenal experience. And Max Wertheimer builds on this and says, well, those unconscious inferences take specific forms like grouping laws. Okay, so that's the sort of deeper philosophical roots of the Gestalt movement. But let's go back a bit and look at the scientific roots. So you're all familiar with Wundt, so it's 1879 in, I think, Leipzig, right? And he sets up the first lab in psychology. And the metaphor that governs his thinking, and I think I've learned this from Ken, is all human thinking is very metaphorical. Certainly his is, or analogical. The governing metaphor there is the periodic table. It has blown people's minds in the 1850s, 60s, that all this complexity of matter can be reduced to this incredible simplicity. And so Wundt is governed by this metaphor and says there must be atoms of the mind. Let's find them. So his movement is both introspectionistic and reductionistic. Let's look at our own experience and try to find out what the atoms of the mind are. William James, in a parallel movement, focuses in on the structure of consciousness, and he writes about it in a very beautiful way. He's not so focused on experiments. Titchener goes on to Cornell, has spent time in Wundt's lab, and is focused on introspectionism. So the movement now is unlike anything that exists now. It would involve, for example, taking a grad student and putting an apple on a table and saying, what are the atoms of your experience? And the grad student would say, I don't know, redness and roundness? Good, right? Well, there's two kind of reactions against this sort of what now we would regard as unscientific thinking. One of them is Watson, John B. Watson, who says this is garbage. Right? Titchener is, this is just garbage, and it rejects the introspectionistic aspect of the Wundtian structuralist movement, but keeps the reductionism. And it's followed by Thorndike, Skinner. But then there's a parallel rejection about the same time, around 1910 or so, that rejects the reductionism of Wundt's project, but keeps the introspectionism, and that's the Gestalt psychology movement. And his students, Kurt Kofka, Wolfgang Köhler. Interestingly, a lot is going on in Germany at this time, as you know, and around this time you have the rise of Nazism in the aftermath of World War I. And this leads essentially to the decimation of the Gestalt psychology movement, because Wertheimer then goes on to the New School for Social Research. Kofka, I forget.
Smith College.
Smith. And anyway, where did, it doesn't matter. Anyway, they all came to America, but America is dominated now by behaviorists who have the opposite worldview. But these people had tremendous courage. Wolfgang Köhler was incredibly brave and wrote the last public criticism of the Nazis. They had just been voted into power, and in April 1933, he basically said, you Nazis are completely foolish to fire the top intellectuals of the nation, and he fully expected to be arrested that night. And the story is that he and his grad students played chamber music until 4 a.m. waiting for the Gestapo to come by and arrest him, but they didn't, and then he went on to America. All right, so getting back to the history, you have these two parallel rejections of Wundt, one rejecting introspectionism, the other rejecting reductionism. The Gestalt movement is almost wiped out. There are some little threads of it that remain, certainly in the work of Michaud, in Leuven, and Knizia in Trieste, and Wertheimer actually plays a role in the training of Irvin Rock, and so the flame remains somewhat alive, even in America, who then trained Steve Palmer, I think. So there's some flickers of the Gestalt movement staying alive. It's not totally dead. All right, now then you have a parallel movement going on, coming out of a different field, which was von Neumann and the computing architecture that he played a role in developing. So you have the development of a cybernetic sort of approach, and this afforded a new metaphor for our field, which was that the brain is like a computer. And Chomsky, George Miller, Broadbent, Jerome Brunner, a whole bunch of people around 1956 say, oh, we have a new governing metaphor. It's not a black box, it's a computer in there. And there's a problem with this, right? This is still the governing metaphor of our field, which we now call cognitive neuroscience, namely that the brain is something like a computer, but this is, oh, what, do I have to stop? No. Oh, I see. And so the governing metaphor is, but the brain is not like a computer, right? It's a computer's not conscious. Computers don't rewire themselves every second. Computers are not, there's no software-hardware distinction. So what I think Ken and Patrick accomplished is the second flourishing of Gestalt psychology, and that's of enormous importance, and all of us here are now the inheritors of that movement, and we will carry it on. Then the question is, okay, what does that mean for the future? Where do we come from? Well, I've talked about that. What are we? We're a movement that emphasizes the importance of the constructive aspects of not only perception, but cognition, emotion, all of that. And where are we going? Well, I think where we're going could be summed up with a term, Gestalt neuroscience. And that will look very different. It'll play out over not just our lifetimes, but our students and over many, many generations. And it will involve radically new forms of science. I think that in the future, we'll have to embrace human neurophysiology and take Penfield to a whole new level where we can microstimulate particular neurons and ask people, what are you experiencing, right? So if you have three basic sources of information, namely behavior/psychophysics, the brain as observed through different methods, whether neurophysiology or MRI or PET or whatever, the third thing that we're largely ignoring in neurophysiology is consciousness or experience itself and controlling that. And so I think some of us here may play a role, hopefully someday, in going beyond ECOG and really embracing human neurophysiology. And I can't predict where the whole movement will go, but I just wanted to end saying, what Ken and Patrick have given us is the rebirth of this old movement that the Nazis almost destroyed. And we're all a part in keeping the movement alive, and we should push it towards its further flourishing. All right, thank you.